I want to thank Professor Savard and Roussel and the organizers of this conference, and as an anthropologist, I especially want to thank all the historians and policy experts who work on the topic of Indigenous people in the military, which is so valuable. The Japanese Empire emerged dramatically on the international political stage in the early 20th century, and as Japan strove to prove itself a modern nation, the government's relationship with its indigenous groups followed American and European models, although also affected by Japanese ideas. Our paper focuses on three groups that were managed in the same way in the imperial bureaucracy. The Ainu, well, I thought that would work. Yeah, the Ainu of northern Japan, the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, and the islanders of the Micronesian region. The Ainu, living in the northern islands of Japan, were a hunting and fishing people invaded by farming and commercial expansion through the 19th century. The Ainu experienced parallels that of indigenous peoples at the frontiers of settler colonies elsewhere, so you are all familiar with their history without knowing much about it in detail. Dispossession, resettlement, segregation, assimilationist pressure, and discriminatory racial ideology. By the 1930s, Ainu were politically incorporated as Japanese citizens, but they were not culturally assimilated. Their distinctiveness remained in religion, separate schools, constraints on their ownership of land, and the pervasive representation of their culture as primitive, for example, in the popular media or in ethnic tourism. Taiwan was ceded to Japan in 1895 after the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan intentionally developed Taiwan's colonial policy as a model for its further imperial expansion. The bureaucrats quickly defined the indigenous peoples of the eastern mountains, you can see on the map along the east, as different from the majority the majority Chinese-speaking population of Taiwan, and treated them differently. First, with military pacification of the tribes, forced resettlement on reservations, pressure to acculturate, and heavy policing. As war approached, the tribal people were drawn into the intense patriotic program that affected everyone in the Japanese Empire. Like all the people of Taiwan, indigenous people were subjects of the emperor, but they were never citizens. The third population we will talk about is the people of Micronesia, from the northern Marianas Islands and Palau in the west, through the Caroline Islands to the Marshall Islands in the eastern Pacific. This entire region came, except for Guam, came under Japanese control when Germany was stripped of its colonial possessions at the end of World War I, and the region was assigned to Japan as a League of Nations mandate. Japan integrated the islands into its expanding empire through economic development and immigrant settlement from Taiwan, Okinawa, and Korea. And by the 1930s, through military fortification. This became the empire's eastern edge. As Asian immigration increased, the islanders lost control of their homelands. They learned Japanese and adopted Japanese customs, but they were made aware that they were not and could never become Japanese citizens. As Japan established its colonial empire, its ideology of racial categories created a paradox for colonial subjects. They were exhorted to assimilate, to identify as Japanese in language, thought, and behavior. And you see that here in Japanese schools in Yap and Palau in Micronesia, and here, 50 years earlier, the Ainu undergoing the same assimilative process, going to school in Tokyo. But even the most outwardly assimilated were denied citizenship rights, except for the Ainu, and could never be considered fully Japanese, and that included the Ainu. Even though they were citizens, they were not considered fully Japanese. With the approach of war, the question of identity became increasingly urgent and increasingly difficult, sometimes even dangerous, for the colonial people to navigate. the ordinary colonial policy of cultural assimilation was replaced by a wartime program of intensive spiritual indoctrination called Kominka. This is a group of students doing the morning exercise of admiration and respect for the emperor in Taiwan. This Kominka program, which intensified the loyalty, commitment, and concept of service to the emperor, applied to indigenous groups as it did to all the imperial subjects, and they automatically came under the scope of wartime planning. However, this does not mean they were treated like Japanese nationals or even like other colonial subjects of the empire. Here, just to remind you of what was going on at this point in time. As we said, the Ainu were considered Japanese citizens in the 1930s. So Ainu men enlisted or were conscripted as regular soldiers. On the left is an Ainu enlistment ceremony. They served alongside the other Japanese in the military, not in ethnically segregated units. Ainu men served in the Aleutians, the Solomon Islands, Okinawa, and on the Soviet border, where a group of them were taken prisoner and held for years, along with Japanese POWs in Siberia. Ainu at home supported the war through labor in coal, agriculture, and other vital industries. Although Hokkaido was not bombed until late in the war, people suffered from food and goods shortages, dislocation, intensified labor, and security constraints. The greatest impact of the war on the Ainu occurred at its very end when, in the final weeks of war, Soviet troops invaded South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, and a group of Ainu ended up actually being pushed completely off their land and sent to the new borders of Japan. While they were integrated into military units along with Japanese, Ainu maintained a distinctive identity during the war. They drew on their own traditions for protection, wearing talismans made of foxtooth or mountain elm bark, carrying these prayer sticks, ritual prayer sticks called inao, during the war. The Ainu saw their war service as demonstrating their loyalty and their identity as Japanese. Years after the war, an Ainu elder recalled that feeling of shared patriotism during that time when she said, "No one said then, you are an Ainu, or Ainu cannot be in the army. Our Ainu fought side by side with Japanese soldiers and were imprisoned in Siberia with them." Sharing the experiences and sufferings of other Japanese citizens, the Ainu came the closest of the three cases to merging imperial subject with Japanese identity. Yet even for them, the paradox of assimilation and equality nonetheless remained. Unlike the Ainu and indigenous Taiwanese, the Micronesians' homelands were combat zones. War preparations in the late 1930s brought Japanese air bases, military garrisons, and naval depots to the area, forcing land confiscation and relocation. Micronesian men, not being citizens, were not allowed to enlist in the regular Japanese armed forces, but they participated in military work, for example, being lookouts or being cremation attendants. Women and children absorbed additional work at home, and eventually they too were conscripted for labor when agricultural needs increased after the sea lanes closed, which trapped large garrisons on small islands. The Kominka program, encouraging Micronesians to identify as imperial subjects, lost its effectiveness over the years of war, as starvation and mistreatment took their toll. Then American bombing and invasion, 1944-1945, destroyed Micronesian lives and livelihoods, along with destruction of the Japanese military. In contrast to Ainu and indigenous Taiwanese, who identified as loyal Japanese, most Micronesians did not feel strong support for the imperial struggle. For most islanders of Micronesia, the perception of the war then and now is that it was not our war. That's a quotation that people often say in the islands. It was a conflict between two global powers in which they were unwilling observers, forced participants, and unhappy victims. To look more at the Taiwanese case, I'm now going to turn it over to Professor Tsai.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to follow in the presentation with the topic Indigenous Taiwanese wartime experiences. Taiwan was also required to provide military manpower for indigenous communities. Yeah, this one. Okay. This era is vividly recalled in terms of efforts to instill the Japanese spirit. This was strikingly successful in the case of the young men who volunteered for the ethnic military units created for indigenous Taiwanese and the Takasago volunteers, in Japanese Takasago Kyodai. 8 Takasago Kyodai were called up starting in 1942, about 8,000 indigenous men who served throughout the Southwest Pacific. Enlistment and service in Takasago volunteer units brought men from different tribes into close, sustained contact for the first time, laying groundwork for a sense of shared identity as indigenous Taiwanese. From oral histories, we see how indigenous culture and identity shaped wartime activity. For example, a Bunun veteran explained, quote, joining with the Japanese was like joining the strong tribe. In Bunun culture, when we are needed, we go to fight. Bravery is rewarded in your social standing in the tribe. I was not afraid of getting hurt, of dying. So that's from the veteran from Bunun, indigenous people in Taiwan. And it is clear from their memories that indigenous veterans were motivated both by a desire to fulfill their duty to the emperor and to assert their tribal identity. The Takasago volunteers were publicized as a success of assimilation policy. However, their Japanese spirit was at once a means of resistance to colonial discrimination and a reinforcement of indigenous identity, such as hunting and bravery. While these three groups differ in how they experience the war, in each case we can see the persistence of a sense of identity that did not disappear on the part of either the indigenous people or of the state. The empire's essential paradox of unity and the otherness did not disappear during wartime. In fact, it was emphasized. Therefore, we see the use of indigenous images in propaganda. For example, a popular war era story and film set in Taiwan, The Bear of Sayun, lauded the patriotic self-sacrifice of young Ataya women and that of the tribe's young men who longed to serve as Takasago volunteers. In each case, we see the primacy of local identity maintained throughout the war, maintained in part by the empire's own ethnic categories and discrimination, but also by indigenous people's persistence in their own ideas, traditions, and self-concept. Despite assimilationist efforts, indigenous communities went into the war as a distinct culture. Wartime experiences confirmed these distinctions and post-war life expanded. And the end of war was the beginning of the new international order. All three indigenous groups came under new foreign post-war regimes, and the USSR's assault on Japan's northern border split the Ainu, with some in the conquered territory relocated to Hokkaido, where they had never lived, while those who remained came under Soviet policies. American occupying force did not protect Ainu communities. In the 1970s, Ainu leaders began to connect with the international indigenous rights movements. And from that era, more focused activism combined with changing international context produced a positive Ainu identity. After much effort, Ainu were declared an indigenous people by the Japanese government in 2008. Historians of indigenous Taiwan describe the post-war period as a second era of colonialism, which is China, the KMT government. For Takasago veterans, this was a period of silence, as their loyal service to the emperor became dangerous to them in the new political environment. They felt that their loyal service was unrewarded. Veterans and their families rarely spoke of their war experiences. It was only after the discovery of the last Japanese soldier in Indonesia in 1974, who was in fact an indigenous army man, The interest in Takasago volunteers emerged. In 1977, some Takasago veterans went to the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo to request to return of the spirits of their ancestors who were killed in the Pacific War. And as Taiwan's politics developed, indigenous identity became entangled with national politics. Competing visions of Taiwan as Chinese or as Taiwanese drew on indigenous symbols. Like Taiwan, Micronesia, as a conquered territory, immediately came under new governance as an American rule area under UN oversight. As a result of their wartime and post-war experience, they are aware of the power and danger of that location. They have used their historical experience and geostrategy locale to speak against nuclear weapons and more recently for solutions to climate change. Memories of the Pacific War allow islanders to evaluate different world powers and to feel confident in their ability to take assertive global policy stance despite their small population and related political weakness. In conclusion, while each community's experience is unique, these groups share certain qualities as small-scale, politically coherent communities encapsulated within nation-states. States have consistently seen indigenous differences in social evolutionist terms and seeking to civilize them through often harsh policies. But aggressive assimilation efforts have not in the long run erased these communities. Indigenous peoples have demonstrated a compelling ability to maintain cultural distinctiveness and social political autonomy under pressure. War is certainly the condition under which the nation state is at its most assertive, its most intolerant of otherness, and most demanding of loyalty. Yet even the pressure of universal mobilization in pursuit of war cannot persuade empires to fully integrate all subjects without discrimination and cannot succeed in stripping subjects of their local identity. Merci.